Welcome to this edition of Fuel for Thought. I'm Kristen Valacia, Vice President of Consulting Services at S&P Global Mobility. Today I'm joined by my colleagues, Mark Boyadjis, Global Technology Lead, Consulting Services, and Claudio Vittori, Associate Manager, Supply Chain and Technology. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hi, Kristen. Thanks for having us today.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
Absolutely. So today we're going to be talking about something that the industry has really been talking about for a number of years, if not a decade or more, around EVs. But more recently, the concrete investment and product plans have been shared by pretty much all of the global OEMs. But as these offerings and volumes finally come closer to fruition and realization, the EV charging infrastructure comes more into hyperfocus. Certainly as a hurdle that has to be cleared and a key enabler to a variety of different customer types. But there are a lot of considerations, and this is what we're going to dig into today. Really the picture here, the size, the scope, but also the regionality, the technology, and the rate and nature of adoption that all are going to influence, and in fact are already influencing, what's required and what type of investments we're seeing. So Mark, why don't we start with you and start by talking about the magnitude of this change driving the need for this rapid and rapidly evolving charging infrastructure investment. So the question a lot of people probably have are EVs really growing fast enough, and will they continue to grow fast enough for all this hype about charging networks?
Sure. Thanks, Kristen. It is a bit of a pendulum at times, moving from the vehicle side and watching the demand grow to the charging side and seeing the investments from federal, state, local utilities and other investors, put the infrastructure in place. In a perfect world, it's natural equilibrium, and they come at the perfect time, and everything is matching what it needs to be. But on a global basis, we see a continued growth in production of these electric vehicles, and the R&D development for internal combustion is all but gone, across the industry. So, this is starting to hit that inflection point between early adopters and fast followers into mainstream volume adoption of this, and that's what we'll see over the next 5 to 8 years. Looking deeper into some of these markets, though, you really start to see this attribution. Today, in 2021, S&P estimates that there's roughly 2.2 million BEVs and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles on the road in the US market alone. And by 2030, that should be around 32 million. So that's a substantial growth of vehicles in operation that are going to be pluggable. And the thing is if we take a bit of a history lesson and we look at, frankly speaking, Tesla, they had built the car largely before they had built the network. And so after Model S and Model X launched, right, there was a massive investment in the supercharger network, and that's starting to happen in the mainstream automaker, collaboration, where we have this vehicle lineup that's starting to occur. Just about every OEM has at least one offering today, two offerings, but it's going to start to really flow faster. And because of that, there's equal investment now in building out the infrastructure, both in the US and in Europe and Asia. And each region and each country has its different timelines based upon when things are going to pick up speed. But globally, this momentum shift, the inertia that the industry has is quite substantial.
Now that's a good point, though, because so VIO is growing, the future forecast is growing, and you talk about pretty high level numbers, right? You talk about globally, you talk about nationally, but I live in Michigan. I was just in New York. You were just in California. It's certainly not the same story everywhere, right? So what are you seeing there, and what are the considerations around? And you mentioned every OEM has one, maybe two, or most OEMs have one, maybe two offerings. What are you thinking about regionality, segment, brand that is going to influence this EV charging infrastructure?
Yeah, the reality is you can talk about global trends. You can even talk about national trends, right? The US versus Germany and things like that. But when it comes to the distribution of EVs, when it comes to the installation of charging stations, this happens on a local level. And that cannot be, you cannot underscore that enough, because it is to the point today where most regions where there's electric vehicle sales, you have a pocket, where there's popular adoption of the technology. In the US, it's California, right? In China, it's the major tier 1 cities. And because of that, you can kind of hyper focus your attention. But as the industry grows and you get more broad scale adoption for electric mobility in these different regions, you need to consider how that transition occurs. In the US, if we take the US and break it into its 50 states plus DC, you can look really closely at where the VIO trends are on a state to state level. And more importantly, how that matches up to the infrastructure they have to serve those electric vehicles today. So it's this careful view at taking a national view and breaking it into a state to understand the state dynamics. California, for example, in 2021, they had about 39.2% of all BEVs and PHEVs in operation. But that number, while it's almost 40% of the market, that'll drop to about 21% by 2030. Because in that time frame, states like Texas and Florida and New York and New Jersey are going to grow dramatically, and even mainstream Midwest states, right? The heart of the country started to grow the demand for these electric vehicles, and that's going to see this shift away from pockets and into more broad scale adoption. And so, national views broken into state level views, looking very closely into cities and census tracts. It's very important to have that scope all the way up and down the chain, so to speak.
And I think that's a good segue. When you talk about California and the almost 40% share, you could say the same thing about brands, right? So you look at a brand like Tesla, and 80% of US EV sales in 2020 were Tesla, right? Which, as you mentioned, happens to have their own charging network. So Claudio, how are these charging technologies different? And as more brands and more players get involved in this charging infrastructure, investment and build out, how are those technologies different? And how does that influence investment, usage, build out considerations?
Yeah, Christian, it's a very great question. I mean, as a team, we are forecasting a steep increase of charging station deployment over the next 10 years. We are talking about like more than 60 millions of stations installed globally. But as Mark said, I mean, there are a lot of differences on where the stations will be installed and which type of station will be installed, and the type of usage of station is also changing drastically on a country base, on a region base, on a city level base. We are seeing that in some countries like, for example, North America and Europe, I mean, the deployment of domestic station has been the driver so far, with most of the installations installed at home, with most of the consumers still relying into the domestic installation, while other regions like China, where the overall architecture is slightly different, the rely on private, on domestic infrastructure will be less important in the near future. So we will have big differences. And when it comes to specific, region or city infrastructure, the deployment of DC charging infrastructure might change, where I'm talking about the level 3 infrastructure, where might be more frequent into the highways, but of course there might be more hurdles on having high speed charging stations into the city center or nearby the city centers.
Interesting. And so the other thing, maybe being a little bit provocative here, I know most of our listeners are in the industry or related, but as just a general consumer, Mark and Claudio, right? Consumers are going to decide what works and what doesn't, and what's a sufficient type and quantity and location. But at the end of the day, don't we all just really want to charge at home?
Yeah. We all do. We want to make it easy and seamless. I'll go into a bit of some anecdotes here quickly, but what was interesting is I was fortunate enough to spend some volunteer time just last week at a local auto show, and I was there just kind of answering questions for consumers who want to know more about what it's like to own an electric vehicle. Where do I charge it? How much does it cost? Is it going to save me? What's the, where's the battery come from? Where's this product made? Is it really recyclable? All these sorts of questions. But what I think comes down to it, Kristen, your point's very valid. We just want to have a a mobility experience that we're familiar with. That's what the consumer is familiar with, and so why change it? Unfortunately, changing your perspective on how you fuel and operate your car is kind of an imperative to moving to electric mobility. It doesn't have to be a substantial change, but it's really just about changing the way you think about when you're fueling up and how often you fuel up and the distances you really need in order to fuel up. I say this a lot. Driving an electric car, you fuel where you park. You do not drive to fuel. More often than not, people are just parking and then charging where they're parking. More often than not, that's overnight parking, right? Because that's your 6, 8, 10 hours, depending upon what your schedule looks like. And that's a really convenient way to have a really sustained and convenient e-mobility experience, because every time I start my car, I've got a full battery and I've got my full range. And so while that's perfect for anyone who owns a single family home and has a garage, there's huge portions of population who still buy and operate cars that don't have access to a garage, right? Or their apartment garage doesn't have charging or things like that, and they can't control that directly because they were live through an association. So it's elements like this that there's an education transition that has to occur. And the public charging infrastructure needs to be built out in a way that it serves everybody's needs, both mainstream consumers, low-income buyers, luxury premium buyers. And because of that, you see this vast array of development of DC fast charging, local level 2 charging, and even level 1 charging that can provide that trickle support. So do we all want to charge at home? Yeah. Are we all going to be able to? Probably not. So we need to think about how we enable all the customers, all those VIO that are in the park today, as they transition to EVs, what they're going to do, and that's kind of the main goal for the industry right now.
So Mark, you opened the door there for Claudio question that I wanted to ask you, which is, you said you don't go somewhere to charge; you charge where you park, right? And we know there's a lot of big players out there making investments like Electrify America and EVgo and ChargePoint. But there are other things in the works, or at least being investigated, right, Claudio? So when we talk about wireless charging or battery swapping, what's going on there? And is that going to be a reality anytime soon?
Yeah, I think Mark raised a very good point. I mean, most of the consumer will go into the shifted the paradigm of driving a car which is always fully charged at home. But if you go a bit deeper into the consumer expectations, I think there might be a good portion of the consumer that are looking for some alternative for avoiding like very heavy, dirty cables to be plugged into the public domain along the streets, or they are looking for some technologies that are more comfortable on just leaving the car in a parking space without caring about how to park the car and just getting a refull batteries. I think some players are now investing in these technologies. I think Y3City in US is a good name to be mentioned, because they are since many years is working with OEMs and other suppliers on trying to make the wireless charging solution adoptable in the market into as a cooperating with OEMs, as well as working together with the private users. I think some other solutions like battery swapping are emerging. I mean, we do know the NIO OEM, Chinese OEM, operating already in the brand into the technology and already pretty well developed in terms of network in China, starting now in Europe. I mean, apart from the global OEMs, we do have other players, especially in North America, that are investigating the technology. I think the overall aim is to try to offer us an alternative solution to all the consumers that are not happy on the conventional solution in place, which means plugging your car in a station and transforming, the charging session in a more in a smoother and more appealing way for all the consumers not having access to the domestic stations.
So a lot of considerations there and a lot of different things going on. So let's close with each one of you. what do you think is going to be the biggest influencing factor in EV charging growth? And I'm gonna say that globally. So across the globe, what do you think? Claudio, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there are probably plenty of factors. We can say that, of course, the deployment of electric vehicles is one of the driver in terms of, all the private institution working and investing into the charging infrastructure. Because as soon as the demand will grow, of course, there might be more business and more opportunities of enlarging the offering of charging stations. I think especially for the next few years, the pledges of the government, of the public bodies might be important for for some regions, especially for the not the first movers ones. So sort of financial support might be beneficial to extend the infrastructure. And of course, I mean, there might be also probably a good portion of consumer that are not really well aware about the type of infrastructure that is around. So the reliability of infrastructure as well as and in a sort of education process of the users towards how to use the charging infrastructure might be also beneficial to extend and to enlarge the scope of charging infrastructure deployment globally.
Great. Mark, what about you?
So I think the saying goes, money talks, right? And I think that is the central next step for the charging infrastructure deployment is twofold. It's about the funding to build it out, and on a completely different level, it's about helping customers understand their total cost of ownership and the costs to charge. Those two things, money talks, right? As soon as you start to see this funding really start to establish that network, the consumer will start to become more and more aware with what they have at their disposal. And, that's the point where you'll start to see anyone from the basic economic minded to the, advanced financial modelers saying, wow, this makes a ton of sense. I'm saving 80% on my fueling for my car. I'm making that number up, but it's substantial. And the point is you need to bring customers to the cars in order for them to experience this. And one of the things that Claudio referenced and that we hear constantly is, well, I don't know where charging stations are. There's no charging stations around me. Even though I can guarantee you in the US, you're no longer, if you're living in an urban center, you have one within 5 square miles easily. The point I'm making is like, you got to bring people to these charging stations. And as soon as you start talking about the financial and the economics of this, it really gets exciting for consumers. And I think that's the thing that will kind of tip the scales a little bit towards more charging and more electrification adoption, is understanding that total cost of ownership is dramatically lower than what we're all used to. So making that change might change the way we drive and fuel our cars, and that might be uncomfortable, but what will be comfortable is the extra money in our bank accounts.
Absolutely. Well, great points and fantastic insights as usual, Claudio and Mark. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we'll be back with more Fuel for Thought next month. To opt in to our newsletter that provides more information on this topic and others, visit spglobal.com/mobility.